The fighting represents the latest crisis in the North African nation between two of the country's most powerful generals. The collision of cultures, religions, and ethnicities in Sudan has led to nearly 50 years of civil war. Since independence in 1956, there have only been 11 years of peace. Until 2011, Sudan was Africa's largest country by landmass, with the roots of its instability dating back to the early 80s, when farmers of African descent were involved in clashes with nomadic herders of Arab descent, fueled by a fierce competition for land. Civil war was sparked in 1983. However, in 1989, a compromise between the ruling government and the southern opposition groups hoped to bring imminent peace, but this was thwarted by a coup led by military leader Omar al-Bashir, whose vision was to keep Sudan unified by all means. On 11th April 2019, he was toppled by the military on the backdrop of a nationwide protest and an economic meltdown.
When Omar Bashir was toppled during the 2019 Sudanese revolution, people really believed that the military regime and the rule of the military was going to come to an end, and that essentially the people would be given a voice, the people would be listened to, and the people of Sudan would actually have control over their own destiny. But unfortunately, that's something that did not happen. The military regime of Omar Bashir was replaced by another military regime, and essentially what happened in this case was that civilian rights were undermined, and they were underserved and not recognized. And to be honest, this only contributed to an aggravation of the political and socio-economic situation within the country of Sudan. This is something that we see until today, and which cumulated with the current situation within the country.
The rise of Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Abdel-Rahman Burhan was received as a victory for the people of Sudan by many, as negotiations for a transition to a civilian government began between the protesters and the military government. An uneasy path to the handover to a civilian government over a period of 2 years was charted. Unfortunately, yet again, all hopes were dashed in 2021 when yet another coup overthrew the transitional government. General Burhan dissolved the Sovereign Council and the transition government led by Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. General Burhan has led Sudan to date.
General Burhan has been able to maintain a very powerful position because of a multitude of factors. On the one hand, we can say that the military is very strong. And in this part of the Middle East and Africa, this entire region, in general, the military, as we have seen in other parts as well of the region, tends to have a very powerful a very powerful weight, and this is something that happened in Sudan as well. So the legitimacy of General Burhan was also recognized and supported by the military, but it was also supported by other powers, by foreign powers, by powers internationally outside of Africa in the Western world, which is something that has contributed to the aggravation of the situation because of the fact that different powers essentially managed to take advantage of the fact that Sudanese society was so divided, and that they could support Burhan while also supporting other powers.
The rise of the rivalry between Sudan's de facto leader and head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Burhan, against General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo of the paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces has its roots in the Omar al-Bashir era, when the former leader intentionally built up both forces and often deliberately set them against each other in his quest to maintain a firm grip on power. Although the clash turned violent on April 15th of this year, the tension between the two groups had been brewing for years.
There's a very interesting perspective that can be expressed whenever we talk about the situation about General Dagalo, who is known also as Hemeti, and when we talk about Burhan, because of the fact that if we go back in time to 2019, when there was a Sudanese revolution, Burhan and Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, worked together, and they contributed to the formation of an alliance to topple Omar Bashir. So essentially, I remember I was reading a couple of articles a while back that were saying that towards the end of the month of March, the end of last month, essentially what had happened was that there was no speaking terms between General Burhan and General Hemeti. So essentially, we see the separation between both the generals and the increase of this gap, which contributed to the increase of instability within Sudan, because of the fact that over time, despite the fact that both of these men worked together, they essentially over time began separating and creating their own militia forces, which contributed to the creation of instability within the country.
We have Burhan, who is heading up the SAF, Sudan Armed Forces. And then you have Hameti, who is heading up the Rapid Support Forces. The Rapid Support Forces at one point were a proxy army for the SAF. And they are now fighting each other in what I believe is a proxy war. This is the makings of World War III.
Could this explosion be instigated by the RSF's growing need to have key military positions and control economic assets, and its role as a group whose guns are allegedly now for hire?
It is entirely due to economic resources. I mean, one just has to look at the amount of riches that Sudan has. Sudan isn't just one of the richest countries on the African continent. It is also one of the richest countries on the international level, on the global level. It has so many resources, not only limited to petroleum, to oil and gas, but also to gold, to uranium, to minerals. And as well, interestingly enough, lots of people aren't aware of the fact that Sudan has lots of agriculturally fertile land, which has been attracting investors from different parts of the world. So essentially, we can see that with the Western world has its eyes on our part of the world, has its eyes on the Middle East and Africa, which is why that they all want a part of the cake of Sudan. They all want to be able to have access to Sudanese resources. And to be honest, if Sudan did not have the resources it has, we would not see the situation it is in today, because it is such a fertile land. It has so many resources, and essentially different political powers from across the world are trying to get access to these resources and to be able to benefit from the instability in order to benefit from the economic benefits that Sudan has as well.
So everybody, like most of the continent, everybody wants a piece of our land, of our sacred, rich land. And this is why these two armies are killing each other and using us, the civilians, as their human shields, killing us along with them.
On the backdrop of this conflict is a global power struggle between the US and Russia over influence in Sudan. Following a visit by Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in February of this year, the Sudanese military government agreed to host Russia's first ever naval base in Africa on its port of Sudan, giving Russia a permanent presence in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. During the same visit, Lavrov also pledged that Russia would provide Sudan with weapons. It is also reported that the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group has made huge inroads in securing substantial amounts of gold from Sudan.
We do have deep concern about the engagement of the Prigozhin group, the Wagner group, in Sudan. It's in so many different countries in Africa, an element that, when it's engaged, simply brings more death and destruction with it. It's very important that we not see its further engagement in Sudan, and I know a number of countries are very concerned with that prospect.
Before the most recent conflict broke out, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken made a statement in what many described as the denouncing of Sudan's military government, as he encouraged the rapid formation of a civilian-led transitional government. Are these events a timely coincidence or an intentional build-up to a modern-day Cold War proxy battle, such as those experienced in Africa during the 1960s?
I do believe that this is a proxy war. Sudan is being used as a pawn between different Western powers. Essentially, it ignited friction within the military system of Sudan, and it led to so many disturbances and instabilities across the region. And it literally fragmented the country of Sudan today, because if we look just a couple of decades ago, there was no South Sudan and Sudan. It was a united country, and then it became Sudan and South Sudan. And there are talks there's going to be Darfur as well as a third independent state because of separatist movements. So essentially, we can say that it is a proxy war, and the Western world, between the United States, between Western Europe, Russia, and different political entities, have begun interfering into the country in order to support different militia groups, in order to support different identities and different separatist movements, in order to encourage more instability, which would not only contribute to the damage of Sudan as a country and to Sudanese national identity, but would benefit the Western world, as we have seen during the colonial era, and the continuation of this under neocolonialism as well.
With a humanitarian crisis involving multiple nationalities scaling up rapidly in Sudan, the world awaits a permanent solution for lasting peace in the strategic region.
The innocent Sudanese civilians, right, are a very resilient and very powerful people. So what we had decided to do was mobilize and organize using the only form of communication that we had sporadically, and that was the internet, WhatsApp and whatnot. So we hired a bus, and that is what a lot of Sudanese communities are trying to do, to make our way to Aswan. We took what was certainly the biggest risk in my life, and that was to step out of our homes and drive through the war zone. We had to drive all across Khartoum in order to get out. The journey was, for me, so harrowing. And then for us to reach the border and experience so much difficulty, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that there was no humanitarian assistance there, number one. No humanitarian assistance whatsoever. Is it because we're not Ukraine? I have no words.
Vimbai Mutiniri Ekpeyong for Arise News.